Hi, I'm Tim Naftali. I'm director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California. I have the honor and pleasure to be interviewing Ben Bradlee today in Washington, D.C. It's December 14th, 2010. Mr. Bradlee, thank you for doing this.
My pleasure.
I'd like to start because there are going to be students watching this, and this was a most extraordinary thing in your early life. Could you please tell us about taking a classics exam on the USS Philip? Why it was that you...
Oh my God. What exam did I take?
Well, you wanted to finish your degree.
Oh, that's right. I had graduated by Harvard's standards. I'd graduated enough, completed enough that I could be. I had everything in my degree except I hadn't taken a damn exam in the Bible and Shakespeare, and. So at one point, my dad, who was following my career on a destroyer in the Pacific Ocean, ran into some friend at Harvard and told him the story. And he said, well, hell, we'll send him the exam. So they sent the exam to the captain of my destroyer. And on the way back from the wars for that time, we'd been out there almost 2 years, I think. There was this ceremony on the post when the ship was told that Bradlee was taking an exam in the captain's office. And I remember George Hamilton, who was the officer of the deck, sent some messenger down and at the start of it, and the messenger knocked on the captain's door and he said, the officer of the deck presents his compliments, and the shortest verse in the Bible is Leviticus something or other. Jesus wept, and left the office, and there I was with this examination in the Bible and Shakespeare, which I hadn't studied. Good God, it was how the hell I passed it, I don't know.
Now I want again students to know when they complain about their tests that you did this during World War II.
Yes, World War II. Yeah, a few summers back.
Yeah, no, but I mean that you were in the middle of World War II and you were taking a college exam to finish your degree.
That's right.
Does that say something about your stamina, or does it say something about World War II?
It tells you more about my dad, I think, than anything else. He just wanted to wrap that up, and it was actually not as hard as it sounds. Because I had been reading for the last 3 or 4 months. I knew I was going to take it. I'd been reading some Shakespeare and a little Bible, and oh God, that seems so long ago now.
Please tell me, how did you meet John F. Kennedy?
I met John F. Kennedy after the war, and I guess I'd met him in the halls of the Senate as just a young reporter, but I didn't meet him until he moved into a house that was about 5 or 6 houses down from us, where I then lived in Georgetown. And we had wives that were friends, and we had children of the same age. And as he said later, it's hard to make friends that are worth anything when you're running for president. They all want something. And I'm sure I wanted, access to him. But I worked for Newsweek then, so I didn't need hour by hour access. I needed the detail that none of the daily newspapers had picked up. And so he always saved a couple of things for me and for Hugh Sidey, who was my opposite number on Time. So we always had a nugget or two in our stories that was exclusive.
In the 1950s, was it unusual for politicians to be friendly with the press like that?
Well, I think there was maybe unusual. No, I don't think it was really unusual. I think reporters tried to, they had to get close to the people they were covering. And I think most of the time it didn't develop into a warm friendship, but it developed into comfortable position where you had access to the guy and you could reach him if you needed him.
Did you have an understanding with then Senator Kennedy, because you became friends, that, well, this is not for, this is not for the press. This is for you. Ben Bradlee is my friend.
It was all off the record until I put it on. In other words, he could talk perfectly naturally and comfortably to me, but before I used anything, I had to check it with him. I could tell. I mean, that it wasn't very difficult. Occasionally, I'd make a mistake or say puts in some personal detail that he didn't like.
When did you get the sense that he was going to run for president?
Oh, pretty early. I mean, he'd and back in 19, whatever the hell year it was, 56. No, what year was it?
When he tried to be vice president?
Yeah,
56.
It was 56, yeah. And I was not in the States then. I was still living in Paris. But when I came back, I bought a house on a certain block in N Street, and a couple of months later, he bought a house down the block, and we became friends. And our wives became friends. And as he said, it's hard to make friends if you're running. And he knew exactly what I needed out of him, but we got to a point where he could tell what I wanted, and he would say, "You can't use that," if he was about to say something that he didn't want out.
Would you describe him when you first met him as a dark horse candidate? Was he well known in the United States at that point?
He had a certain golden boy quality. I mean, he was a war hero. He was handsome. He'd been sick as hell. He'd had all sorts of physical problems, but he was really a very attractive guy. And he, when we traveled with him, as I did with the press corps, you get to know these guys pretty well. You hear the same goddamn speech over and over and over again, and sometimes he would tell a story and then change the names of the people in the story to be someone in the press corps. He'd be telling some story about an early American incident in the government of whatever. And he'd say, the lieutenant governor, and he said, Mr. Bradlee. And of course, nobody knew that there wasn't Mr. Bradlee except the press corps. And that he was very comfortable to be with.
When did you first meet Vice President Richard Nixon?
Well, I don't remember when I first met him, but it was not a big day in my life, and certainly it wasn't a big day in his life. He was I guess it must have been just at the time of Watergate in the 70s.
Oh, but you did, in 1960, you covered him briefly.
Well, I covered him for 2 weeks, and I went out to, what was he running for in 60? Was he running for?
He was running against Jack Kennedy for president.
Oh, in 60. Yeah, I did. I covered him for 2 weeks. They took the guy that was covering Nixon and had him cover Kennedy for 2 weeks. They had me out there. And it was so different, you couldn't believe it. I mean, whereas the Kennedy press corps was kind of a family mob. You only saw Nixon 3 or 4 times a day, whereas with Kennedy, you had breakfast with him or lunch with him, or you were in the car with him.
Do you remember election night 1960?
I sure do. I was in, I think I was in Hyannisport. In fact, I know I was in Hyannisport. And a bunch of us were in some, I remember the Time reporter was there too, Seide. And I remember that the day, I guess it was election night, or the day after election. He wasn't actually sure he was president until the following day. And yeah, I think it was that night that my then wife and I, went over there for dinner with Kennedy and Bill Walton, who was a painter, who was a Kennedy friend, and I guess Ethel probably was there too.
In the last few days of that campaign, was candidate Kennedy confident that he would win?
Well, I think deep down he thought he was going to win, but I'm not. He never showed me anything that looked like real confidence. I mean, it wasn't that. I mean, he didn't run away with it, as you know. I mean, it was 100 and how many votes was it? 104,000 votes in the entire country that he won by. It wasn't very much.
Television becomes an important part of a campaign.
It sure did.
And as a print journalist, what effect do you think that the debates had? Famous Kennedy-Nixon.
Oh, I think they were critical. They were critical. You can write your heart out, but you can't beat seeing a guy who was as attractive as Kennedy was and as distinct as he was. That's why he was so immediately popular.
Do you remember talking to the candidate, to then Senator Kennedy, about the debates and the effect that they had? Was he surprised at how well he had done in the debates?
Well, he never admitted it to me, but I think he was. I think he was surprised, and I think everybody was surprised. And I'll tell you who was most surprised was that sort of the hardcore press group of 10 or 15 reporters from the big wire services and I can remember Scotty Reston of the New York Times, who I was the pool reporter in the first debate, and I was in the studio with them, and therefore after the debate I had to come out and report to the rest of the press what was going on. And I remember Reston, who was a big cheese in the New York Times correspondent and was the dean of the Washington Press Corps, taking notes from what I was saying. I couldn't believe it.
Jumping ahead, what do you recall of the 1968 campaign?
Oh, God. Tell me who was running and all.
Well, it would be Humphrey against Richard Nixon. This is after Bobby Kennedy was shot.
Yeah.
Humphrey's the...
I don't remember a lot about it. I remember I wasn't close to Hubert and or Hubert's people, and I certainly wasn't close to Nixon.
You were close, though, to Bobby Kennedy's people.
I was close to Bobby, but not as close as I was to his brother. But I was almost more. I found in a just an intellectual way that Bobby was almost more challenging and more interesting and more complicated than Jack was.
Could you unpack that for us, please, a little bit?
Well, I mean, I think Bobby was had a kind of an innocent quality about him that Jack Kennedy didn't have. Jack was cool, and Jack was, whereas Bobby, you got the impression that he was, he was really involved in the tiniest little crowds of 5 or 6 people that he would talk to, and he'd really get involved with them in a way that Jack didn't.
And if we were to bring the third brother in, how did
Teddy was just the younger brother then, and was whatever else he became, he was the younger brother, and did errands for them, and I mean, special, important errands. But I don't think he was not on the inner circle advising him the way Bobby was.
To set up what comes next, please help us paint a picture of the rivalry between the Washington Post and the New York Times. You come to the Post. Where, in comparing the two newspapers in 1970, where's the Post and where's the Times?
Well, the New York Times is on top, and that was what was one of the things. The thing that was, it wasn't one of the things. It was the thing that was driving me. I had been asked by Katharine Graham to come to the Post, and the editor of the Post at that time was a man called Russ Wiggins, who was a very distinguished, absolutely uneducated, but completely informed and the best read man I ever read, a couple of books a day. And he became UN. Didn't he go to the UN? And
I actually don't.
I think so. Anyway, he became a government servant, and I succeeded him.
So then, tell me about the first day that the New York Times published the Pentagon Papers.
Well, I'll never forget it. Just for starters, I mean, it was we had been heard at the Times that was working on a special project that we'd heard it for 3 months, and that they had hired a special office outside the New York Times, and there were 8 or 10 people, and they had passwords, and you couldn't get in, and we knew they were going to drop something on us, but we didn't know what the hell it was. And this was the Pentagon Papers you took.
Yes, indeed.
And then they dropped it on us, and immediately the government moved in, and a day later or 2 days later went to court and stopped them from doing it. While we were scrambling around for it, we had a guy called Ben Bagdikian, who was a national editor, and we sent everybody out and said, "God damn it, we got to have it." And of course, the Times wasn't going to give it to us. And Ben Bagdikian got it, and he came back, and I'll never forget that. He came back with it I think on a Wednesday night, and we published. Oh God, maybe it was a Wednesday morning, and we published Thursday morning. And we had about 6 of us or 7 of us in my house in Georgetown reading it. We spent, I guess 6 or 7 hours from 10 o'clock on just reading it. And then I couldn't read the whole thing, of course, but was trying to find out how to find something that we could publish. So the first installment that we published it was the history of the Pentagon Papers, which was actually quite boring. I mean, it was a McNamara plan to sort of to study the war, and so, but we did it chronologically. So we started off with something that was really not on the news, but we wanted to get it in the paper.
Could you tell us, please, a little bit about the debate? There was a debate at your house in Georgetown over whether to publish or not.
Well, it was a debate, but there were two groups. One was reading the Pentagon Papers, so we knew what the hell we were talking about, or had some idea. And then there were the big shots, like the owner, Katharine wasn't there actually, but a guy called Fritz Beebe, who was the publisher, who was a New York lawyer, came down and sat, and I alternated between 2 rooms, one talking to the reporters about what they had, and B, talking to the owners and the owners' representatives about whether we would publish it. And after the courts had sort of enjoined the New York Times from doing it.
How did you weigh the considerations of national security and the First Amendment?
You know, some of us had a pretty sophisticated understanding of national security. I had been in the Navy during the war. I had a top secret clearance at that time. I knew, I boastfully say that I was a patriot. I was not in any had no intention of hurting my country in any way. But I also was no intention of caving into these people saying, oh, you can't run that because it's classified. I mean, you know, they classified everything in those days. And it was, we kept a couple of things out that we needn't have kept out, but we did. I've forgotten what the hell they were now because they were so unimportant.
Please tell us about how Mrs. Graham made her decision.
Well, she was giving a goodbye party the actual night when we were on the no-go brink. And so she wasn't in my house, but the president of the company was Fritz Beebe, who was a Wall Street lawyer. And he came down and listened to us. And we were working with the reporters on one level, and we were working with Beebe and through him, Katharine. Katharine was giving this goodbye party for some trusted employee, and so wasn't present. But we finally got to a point where we had decided that we had to do it, and we're going to do it. And, you know, we didn't threaten to resign, but it was overt that it was important to us and that there'd be hell to pay if we were told we couldn't. And so we got her on the phone. In the middle of this party, you could hear the glasses tinkling. And talk to her and talk to her and talk to her. And there was a pause, and she finally said, I say the hell with it, let's go with it. And that was it. And we hung up so fast that she, just went ahead.
Please tell us about a call that you got from a William Rehnquist.
From a who?
Rehnquist. Didn't the Justice Department call you afterwards and say you shouldn't be running this?
Oh yeah, but that was we got several of those calls. But we were once we decided that we should do it. Who did you say it was?
Rehnquist, later Chief Justice.
Yeah. Oh God, I don't know if it was him or not, but we got calls from from the Attorney General. Who was the Attorney General?
Well, at that point,
Yeah.
the Attorney General was Mitchell.
Mitchell, yeah. Or the Assistant Attorney General. We got a call from somebody saying you can't do this, and we said by this time we had gone through it all and had convinced ourselves that we should do it. We hadn't told Katharine that we were going to do it, or we wanted to, she owned the paper, we didn't.
At that time, did you have any conversations with Clark Clifford or McNamara, or any of those that had sort of somehow participated
No.
in putting together the Pentagon Papers?
No.
Had you ever heard of the Pentagon Papers before the New York Times published them?
Nope.
So you didn't know that this project that the U.S.
I didn't know about the project, no. And the Times was very secretive about it. They hired us, they moved out of this little unit, out of the New York Times building. And we knew they were off on some project, but we didn't know what the project was.
Well, let's move on to Watergate. What?
I've heard of
June 1972.
Yeah.
June 17th, 1972. Where are you? And you hear that there's been this burglary.
I was in my log cabin up in West Virginia, and I don't think I even had a telephone. And it was a Saturday or a Friday, and I came back Saturday night, and Bob and Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein had this story, and Howard Simons was the assistant managing editor, and they presented me with this story, and it was obviously, it was Watergate. It was the greatest story of my time, and I like to think I didn't accept it immediately, but it probably took me 20 minutes. It was obviously the right story. It had been beautifully reported. We incredibly reported. I mean, there was never, I think there were 400 Watergate stories, and I think in all of that we made one silly mistake about something. I've even forgotten what it was, but it was of no importance.
How did your experience handling the Pentagon Papers influence your management of the Watergate story?
Well, I think it gave me a certain confidence that I hadn't had before. And, I mean, the Post was, we were trying to, it didn't have the great staff that it later had. It was getting it. And when I came over as editor, I had asked Katharine if she would keep any vacancies that were on the staff. So when I got there were 5 vacancies, and that's a huge amount of key vacancies. And we filled that with just top reporters, so that we were building a confidence in ourselves that was impressive, and that if these people were so professional and so qualified that there was no choice but not to believe them. And Katharine finally we had talked to her about the thing, and finally the go no go moment arrived, and I called her, and she was giving this party for who the hell was it? Somebody, the circulation director of the Post was retiring. And we told her about it in a sort of an intense 10-minute conversation. And she said, "Bibi, what do you think, Fritz?" And he said, "Well," and that was all I needed, was the well. He wasn't going to say, "It's absolutely, you can't do it." He just said, "Well, on balance, I think we probably should not." And we moaned and groaned and went after her again. And she finally said, "Okay, let's do it."
How was it that a team of 2 people became the main reporter?
Because they were working. It was a Saturday, and they were working.
But was it unusual for a team to do it as opposed to a single reporter?
Oh, not so unusual then, and especially Saturday. They probably were doing nothing else that was of any real importance. And Bob was they were both quite new on the Post. I think Bob had been there a year, if that. He'll tell you. And Bernstein had been working for the Star. And Bernstein was working, playing his guitar and chasing girlfriends, and he was a graceful writer, and they were the 2 guys there.
Was there any pressure to give it to some senior guys when it became?
Boy, there was a lot, but they weren't working on Saturday and Sunday, and by the time Monday came around, it was too late. I mean, I was going to take it away from them.
So the fix was in by that point. I mean, in other words,
in my mind it was, because we had given it to these 2 young reporters, and they had reported it, and they were right, and they stayed right. That's awfully important.
Share with us some of your "oh my God" moments from that, because I mean, what were the when either Woodward?
I don't spend much time doing that. I mean, once you dove into the water, you were in the water.
No, I meant what I meant. I meant by that was moments when either Carl Bernstein or Bob Woodward came to you with information. You said, "Oh, oh, what a story."
When they came to me with the story?
Yeah.
Oh, sure, there was moments. But that was the moment that we made our decision to go. They persuaded us. And once, I mean, it was just a break-in. Interesting break-in, but it was just a break-in to a political party headquarters. But once there was a $25,000 check that showed up, and that I've forgotten which one of them. I think Carl found it, didn't he, Bob?
In Miami.
In Miami, and once that showed up, and it came from the committee to re-elect the president, and it just tied up, and it was you had a feeling. We all began to have a feeling that it was just right and to keep going, and it wasn't very hard.
When, to what extent was your confidence linked to the fact that Bob Woodward had a special source, ultimately called Deep Throat? How important was that as a source of your confidence?
We all liked his name, and it was a catchy name, and it gave a suggestion of mystery and closeness, and but it soon developed into the fact that they were right. I mean, you take the first tip on faith because you believe in the reporters, but after those tips turn out to be right, and there is a check for $25,000, and you just say, until they're wrong, you got to go with them.
What do you remember from, this is October of 1972, Mr. Woodward has met with Deep Throat, and he comes back saying that the Segretti espionage operation isn't small, and it's large, and there are a lot of people involved. And then you go with that October 10th story, which is important in the history of the coverage of Watergate.
Yeah. Well, Bob Woodward is very persuasive, and so is Bernstein, and the story was right. I mean, once a reporter gets on the track of being right, you don't dump him.
2 weeks later, unfortunately, the error occurs. They report that Sloan, in a grand jury testimony, said that Haldeman was
Yeah, but that was a nothing error. I mean, we said that something happened before the grand jury, and it didn't happen. He said that something happened before the grand jury, and it didn't happen before the grand jury. It happened in front of the United States attorney. But the fact of the matter was the same, that the authorities became aware of it and acted on it. So we made that mistake. It's the only mistake we made in 400 stories.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, I mean, in the history of those 400 stories, it's a small mistake. He said something to the United States attorney. He didn't say it to the grand jury.
Was there any pressure on you to move Woodward and Bernstein off the story after this mistake?
Not that I felt. Once they explained the error.
At this time, television finally takes notice of Watergate, and you get a phone call from CBS.
I do. And that was terribly important. It was terribly important, Cronkite. And because, Cronkite had a position in American journalism that was unique. Nobody else had it. He was sort of the great white father. And if it was, if the great white father said it was true, it was going to sway an awful lot of public people. And he showed a lot of courage in doing that, because who was the president of Paley, the president of CBS, wasn't anywhere near as sure as he was.
Did you get ribbed? Were you somewhat ribbed by some of your colleagues at other newspapers for devoting so much time to Watergate before the CBS report? I mean, were people saying to you, Bradlee, this is going to be a dry well?
Well, I don't know. I've forgotten. I'm sure people said, boy, the Post is out on a limb on this. They're really going all out on it. But I mean, once those stories checked out, we really, I don't remember it being an issue that we stop it at any time. We ran out of news stories for a while.
Tell me, do you recall at one point Woodward comes back from a meeting with Deep Throat, and Deep Throat says, "You're in danger."
I do.
Could you tell us what you recall of that?
Oh God, I don't know. You know, this is
a long time ago.
40 years ago. I remember a conversation with Bob. I have no idea what time of day it was, except on the lawn of my house. I had a house out in suburban Washington, and he said we better not even talk inside because the place might be wired. And so we went out. I remember it was cold, and I remember listening, and I remember saying, you know, probably some unprintable phrase, and we decided to go ahead.
In the middle of April '73, Woodward and Bernstein come to you, and Woodward has just heard from Deep Throat that Haldeman and Dean are out. They're going to resign. And they said, let's go with this. And you decided not to print that for fear you had experienced it. Apparently, it's hard to call a resignation in Washington.
It's hard to what?
It's hard. You've got to be very careful before you announce somebody's going to resign in Washington, because you can be very wrong.
Well, I don't remember that particular. I mean, it may have been for a cycle, but I don't remember it from any longer.
I think it was because you had once reported that J. Edgar Hoover was going to be out, and it didn't. And Bill Moyers had told you that, and it didn't happen.
Yeah, well, that happens.
It sure does.
If your sources are wrong, you're wrong.
Tell us about how the Washington Post got the Pulitzer for public service in 1973.
Well, I mean, you're asking me to go way back. My answer to that would be who the hell else had a story with that remotely as significant as that? I mean, it was a no-brainer as far as looking back at it now. I suppose that it was more difficult, and I think I was on the Pulitzer board at that time, and so when the Pulitzer board was discussing a story of your paper, you had to absent yourself from the thing, so I probably was not in on that discussion. But
well, I think what you mentioned in your memoirs, that Scotty Reston came up to you and said that you guys deserve it, and in fact, originally the jury had not selected the Post.
Well, I think Reston sure as hell was supporting it, and in those days, Reston was such a big cheese that if he decided, you know, he persuaded a lot of people.
Tell me what you...
That would have been they would have made a terrible mistake, you know, giving it to some smaller story of much less consequence.
Do you recall watching John Dean testify?
Oh, yes, I know I did. I mean, once those hearings started, there was no way you could avoid listening to those hearings. If you got into a cab, the cab radio was playing the hearings. And if you walked down the halls of Congress, the doors were open and you could hear the hearings from each office. The town was consumed by that story.
But did you feel, well, I mean, it's a long time ago, did you get a sense of that all the dots were connecting once Dean testified?
Yeah, it certainly did. I mean, well, that was the first person other than ourselves who were reporting these things. We were quoting people, but he was the first person on television who, as I remember it, maybe it was not, but.
What do you recall, if anything, of when you heard that there was a White House taping system?
I couldn't believe it. I probably told them they were crazy. I've forgotten whether it was Bob who told me or somebody else who told me. But the fact is, there was such a taping system, and it was, it became public knowledge that there was, and that was the end of it.
Were you, by the way, were you surprised that there was a Kennedy taping system?
I was. I didn't know about that either, but I suppose now that in sober second thought, as my Greek teacher used to say, it was obvious that they taped. They had to tape if they were talking to people, and how the hell could you remember all of that?
Please tell us what you remember of the Saturday Night Massacre when President Nixon fired Archibald Cox.
Well, I thought I died and gone to heaven. I mean, the news was happening so fast, and Archie Cox was a man that had everybody's respect in Washington. And when he sort of joined, he joined our side, as I think of it now, and he gave us credibility that we didn't have without him.
What was your reaction when you heard about the enemies list?
I don't know. It must have been, you are one lucky son of a gun. That, I mean, things were breaking our way so well and so consistently, and there was no story that threatened to blow the story up.
The Nixon administration, in describing the dirty tricks operation, said that dirty tricks had occurred in all presidential campaigns. As a reporter, do you remember dirty tricks in the 1960 campaign? I mean, had you ever heard of a man named Dick Tuck, for example?
Oh, well, everybody had heard of Dick Tuck, but nobody took Dick Tuck seriously. He was a kind of a wag, and nobody thought that Dick Tuck had the support of anybody important.
So it was
sure. I mean, Dick Tuck was on the campaign train, and but he was not representing the Kennedys in any way.
Well, what would he do? What were his pranks or so?
Oh, I've forgotten them now. I'm sorry.
That's okay, but you remember him.
Oh, sure. I don't remember him personally.
But do you think that campaigns got tougher? I mean, you witnessed a number of them. Were they getting tougher by 1972?
I think the reporting was getting much more basic and much more getting deeper and writing deeper. I think in the olden days, I'm sure there were a handful of reporters who had inside information that they weren't publishing. But once the ship sprung a leak, there was just no stopping it.
What do you think caused that change? Was it Watergate? Was it the success of Woodward and Bernstein?
Yes, I think so. The success of the events that led up to Nixon's resignation.
So do you think that had a chilling effect, though, on the willingness of politicians to be friends with reporters anymore?
They'll be friends with them, but I think they'll watch their derrieres. Yeah.
So maybe the kind of friendship you had with John Kennedy would be less possible afterwards, after the 70s.
But when you have a friend in that high place, it isn't that he's telling you every secret he's got. I'm not sure how much really inside information I was getting that Cal Kilpatrick and Hugh Sidey, the reporters, weren't getting. I don't know. I mean, you could give them little bits of information, and especially news magazines love that little colorful anecdote that was not historically important, but it gave the story great credibility.
One would see, particularly later, and it's not so much the product of Watergate, but more of the Clinton era, that politicians didn't have that sort of private space anymore, let alone the secrets they might have, or but their personal space began to disappear.
They didn't give it up, but I think their advisors began to tell them that they better not do it, because the reporters. There's an awful lot of people in this town who are on the reporter's side, who want to get information out. So it's very hard for a president just to say, to hold 6 people in front of him and say, "Now this can never get out." I mean, it won't happen. It'll get out.
Well, so what do you remember of the day that President Nixon resigned?
Well, I mean, it was the busiest day of my life. I mean, to throw out probably 90% of the paper or 90% of the A section of the paper, start all over again, and to be sure that you had the inside information was very hard. You had no time at all to do it. You had a few hours.
What was your, your paper had played a major role.
That's right.
In shaping American political history in that period.
That's right.
And you were
And we were not ashamed of it.
No, and you were the leader. I know it's a long time ago, but did you feel, were you awestruck? Were you?
I was awestruck. I mean, I couldn't believe it. That, how many other presidents had resigned with their hands in the cookie jar? It never happened. And so you knew you were on the cusp of history that very few people had been on. And you had a paper to get out. You don't understand that pressure. You didn't have a lot of time. You had a few hours. You had reporters who sat down in front of typewriters, some of them, and froze. And you had, that had to be, not coaxed, but they had to be encouraged and reminded that there was no goddamn time.
Do you remember talking to Mrs. Graham on that day or the day after about what happened and what this meant?
Many times. But I talked mostly to, I told her during the day how we were, what it appeared, the story we had, but we didn't have it yet. And then I talked to, she gave this party, and so she was not available on the phone until the end of the afternoon. And then when we finally got her, I talked first to this Fritz Beebe, who was and he wasn't absolutely sure, because Catherine, the first thing when we had a mob phone call there. Every phone in my house, I had some reporter on it or editor, and
well, that was that big important Pentagon Papers decision.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, what did Watergate mean for the Washington Post?
Well, the Pentagon Papers gave us a certain confidence as a company and as a newsroom that was vital, I think, to us. And therefore, it made other decisions more natural and more easy, and we knew how to proceed. And so, in a sense, it was a lot easier.
What was the legacy of Watergate for the Washington Post? How did it change the paper?
Well, I mean, it put us on the map. We became a news story ourselves. Woodward and Bernstein became household words. Nobody had ever heard of Post reporters before.
What did you think of the movie All the President's Men?
Well, I mean, I denied having seen it for years, and I finally admitted that I thought it was a terrific movie.
Why did you deny having seen it?
Well, because I didn't want to appear to be reveling in it. It's until someone plays you in a movie, you've not had a particular experience that is threatening.
That's unlikely. What do you, when Bob Woodward told you about Mark Felt, when he told you the name of Deep Throat,
it didn't mean a thing to me. I'd never heard of Mark Felt before, and I never had met him, and I never did meet him. It became obvious to me that I had to know more. I knew I knew there was such a man. I knew where he worked, and I knew that most importantly, that the information that he had provided had been consistently right. And that was all I needed. But there came a time when I said, "Holy smoke! I got to know his name."
But that's later in the game, though. In the
Quite
initial
late
months,
in the game.
Yeah.
And I remember Bob and I walked out to the square in front of the Post, sat down on a bench, and I said, "Okay, tell me." And he did. It's not as traumatic as it sounds.
Do you think the system worked in the Watergate? Is the Watergate story a story of the system working?
Oh, I think it did. Yeah, it sure is. It may be the classical example of this, from the newspaper point of view, how a newspaper can make history.
How do you think Watergate changed the newspaper business?
Attracted a lot of people into it. That's what it did. And I think it it attracted, and that's the first thing it did. People were saying, "Holy moly, that's a really interesting way to earn a living." And for some reason, it drew a lot of women into the business that had not been. We started seeing young women reporters who were completely attractive as journalists to us, and we began to hire some of them, and they began to mature and be very important in the profession, which they are.
Do you recall talking about Watergate with Ted Kennedy or any of the sort of retrospectively?
Well, I got to remember history. I don't know when all the Kennedys.
Well,
when did Jack was dead,
and so was Bobby, of course.
So was Bobby. So and Ted was not as close, anywhere near as close as friend. So I don't remember talking to a whole lot of politicians about it.
How did Watergate change this town, Washington?
Well, I don't know.
Or did it?
Oh, sure it did. It changed the newspaper business, and it attracted, as I said, attracted a lot of interesting people that I don't think had been attracted to the business before. And it changed the Post, of course, enormously. Changed Katharine Graham enormously. and it changed my life.
How did it change Katharine Graham?
Well, suddenly she realized that she was more than a figurehead. She was more than she had. She was more than an heiress who inherited the paper from her husband. She became the paper. I mean, she was a very important figure in the paper. She made the decision.
How did Watergate change you?
Oh, for God's sakes, it put me on the map. I mean, 20 people in this town knew who the hell I was. And that, that's good and bad. You can do more good if you have more recognition and attract more qualified employees. By God, the people flocked to work for us, and they really wanted to, and they were the best in the business.
Tell us, if you can, because one of the things we've done is we've interviewed Mr. Bernstein, we've interviewed Mr. Woodward. Tell us a little bit about managing them as a team. Were you sort of a father confessor?
Oh, I don't know about that. We were certainly friends, but I knew, and I'm sure they knew they were reporters, and I knew I worked for Mrs. Graham, and but we were a team. We really were a team, and we grew up together in that story.
Tell us, just give us, if you would, a few word pictures of Howard Simons. What was he like?
Howard Simons was a genuinely interesting man. He was a science reporter, medical. He had no training of any kind in it, but he became an expert in all of science, and he became a great friend of mine, and became the managing editor, and he was one of a kind. He just I never met a journalist like him.
Al Lewis.
Al Lewis?
Yeah.
Al Lewis was he was the prototypical police reporter. Never wrote a story in his life, and yet provided the information for more stories than anybody in the paper.
Eugene Bashinsky?
I don't remember him all that well. It was a reporter, a good figure of importance on the paper.
Is there an anecdote or story that I haven't touched on that you'd like to record? Did you?
Oh, geez, there are thousands, but you probably bled me dry, I think.
I hope not. Did you ever meet Richard Nixon after Watergate?
No.
Did you ever talk to any of his sort of men after Watergate, Dean or Ehrlichman or Haldeman?
Probably, but I don't remember that.
They
were not. We were not logical friends, and they didn't seek me out, and I didn't seek them out. And they were out of there. They all went out together.
Well, Mr. Bradlee, thank you for your time. It's been wonderful. We really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.